Welcome, bienvenidos. My name is Roxana. This is Rox Reads, and today we're going to go a little further into a situation that I explained yesterday. The main reason is because I wanted to give a full background on what was going on, and I just realized I have something that's like right there in my eye. I apologize for that. Yesterday I was talking for reasons that we're not going to get into because they're not really relevant to this discussion. We were delving into slavery in Puerto Rico. And one of the things that came out of a lot of conversations yesterday is how little people actually know about Puerto Rico history in terms of the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States, as well as Europe and Puerto Rico. Now, I am going to do a little rundown, and some of the things I might say now might be a repeat of what I said yesterday, but I decided to include three other countries that are Latino countries so that you could see how it all meshes together. There's going to be some things that I'm going to have to look down on my paper because I honestly remember the facts, but not necessarily the dates. And the dates for this is important for the point that I'm trying to make. Now, more important than that, what I wanted to let you know is that given the scope of the situation that happened and how much race relations depend on the history, I wanted to make the point that when you ignore history, you're bound to repeat it. And if there's something that we've known for centuries and centuries, starting it all the way back to the Egyptians and the Romans and the Greeks, who did have slaves, by the way, there has been historically this need of one group of people to try to control another group of people, be it by slavery. Nowadays, modern slavery is trafficking humans and that sort of thing. That's still slavery, by the way. If you are not able to make a living doing what you want to do, and somebody's forcing you to do something you don't want to do, and they control your every move, you're a slave for that person, period. It doesn't matter if it's the person we're talking about is your spouse and you're in an abusive relationship, or if you live in a country where there's groups of people that control certain minorities, etc. So, and the impact of historical racism in a country, every person has a perspective. And at the end of the day, we have to remember that history books are written by the victors. But there are several versions of events. There's always as many versions of events as people that see the events. And then, of course, there's reality. And in order for us to have a better scope on what really happened, what we really need to do is look at several versions of an event and not just the one version that you learned in school or the version that your very rebellious teacher decided to teach you. You should take both versions and then find a couple more versions if you're really interested in the topic, so that you have a more complete idea of what really happened. And don't forget also that you might read three different versions of the events, and your perception of those three readings is probably going to be completely different than my perspective or somebody else's perspective, because we're all different and we all base our perceptions on our reality. So having said that, when I started a live stream yesterday, and because of language, I had to take it down. But I decided to take the most important part of that particular live stream, which was called a history lesson. And I'm going to give it to you now so that if you want to see it again, or if you have any questions, you can go ahead and leave them under this video. So in 1492, Christopher Columbus did his first trip. For those of us who come from Hispanic, Latino countries, there was La Pinta, La Niña, and La Santa Maria were the three vessels that they came in, and they had all these things that happened. The first island that they stopped in, they called San Salvador, which is mainly saying our Savior, because they were all sick and nearly dead, and they finally found a place to stop. That island, is part of the Bahamas right now. Don't know if that's still called San Salvador. Something tells me it isn't, because there's a completely different country called El Salvador. But we're going to leave that there. In 1493, there was a second voyage with 17 vessels, 1,500 men. And that particular voyage November 1493, Puerto Rico was discovered. There was a Taino rebellion later on in 1514. I guess they got tired of thinking that these people were gods and that they were helping. And they went ahead and rebelled against them because of the way they were being treated. And what ended up happening is, of course, the Spanish had a lot more power and better weapons. And so that was quickly disbanded. There were 14,600 Taino Indians. That's what they called them. I call them Tainos. So if you hear me say Tainos, I'm talking about the natives from Puerto Rico. There were 14,600 Tainos. They were quickly split between the people that were there on the island, meaning the Spaniards, and they became slaves. Now, the numbers that I'm going to give you when I'm comparing these 5 countries that I'm about to mention are not going to count necessarily. Well, actually, no, they're not going to count the Native Americans that were in those countries. And yes, they're considered Native Americans because America is not just the United States, it's North America, Central America, South America, and of course the islands. So in 1501, Spain decided to authorize the trade of black slaves, for African slaves. It is official, according to what I found in several documents. In 1517 was when the king actually authorized bringing slaves to the islands. And yes, they are from Africa. I'm going to give you the dates when they were brought in. And I gave you the 2 dates because, as you're going to notice, one of these countries started bringing slaves to their country before it was even allowed. So the 5 countries that I'm going to talk to, I have to let you know that La Española is actually the island where the Dominican Republic and Haiti is, okay? La Española was allowed slaves in 1510. Then came Mexico and Cuba in 1517. Puerto Rico started bringing African slaves in 1518. And the United States started bringing them in 1619. Which means the United States started bringing in slaves way over 100 years after we had started dealing with slaves. That is going to be important much later. Now, obviously, as time went by, certain countries rebelled. And of course, you start having this situation where either for love or rape or however you want to look at it, the Europeans started mixing with blacks and the Native Americans. And so those people in my country were called criollos. Those people started developing their own sense of self and their own sense of country, and they started rebelling. And one of the biggest things that they were able to achieve was abolishing slavery. And here are the numbers for that in the order that it happened. Mexico abolished slavery in 1810, which means they had 311 years of slavery. La Española actually got their own liberation period. They split, basically, and got slavery abolished in 1821. That's also 311 years. The United States abolished slavery in 1865. And that means that the United States had 246 years of slavery. And yes, the point that I'm trying to make is that. But we're going to get into that in a second. Cuba abolished slavery in 1868, which means they had 351 years of slavery. And out of the 5 countries that I'm talking about, because I'm not going to go into Venezuela, Colombia, and all the other ones, but all of them had the same issues. Puerto Rico abolished slavery in 1873, making it the longest with 355 years of slavery. We have been free for 145 years on my island, as opposed to 153 years of liberty for slaves here. Now, the point that I want to make very, very clear is that even though there are some people in the African American community that seem to think that they are the only ones that need reparations, the only ones that were abused, the only ones that were slaves, there were slaves in Latin America for over 300 years. And in the case of my country, it was 109 years more than the slaves that we had here. Now, once that happens, it's 1873, the next big impacting situation is when the United States decided to go to Puerto Rico, and they invaded Puerto Rico. Quote unquote, depending on who you ask, they invaded Puerto Rico because they wanted to help the criollos. There's a lot of versions of why this happened. I'm not going to get into that because that would make this a political argument, and that's not my point. But once the Americans came to the island and then took over for Spain, we had these governors that were sent by the President of the United States to run Puerto Rico, just like before we had governors that were sent from the King of Spain. So we've never been free from any country running our lives, okay? Now, I was told several things, including, well, you didn't have Jim Crow, you didn't have this, you didn't have that. I'm not going to get into specifics on this particular episode, but I want you to understand that if you really want to know how the average Puerto Rican is treated by the U.S. government, I would ask you to research a thing called the Ponce Massacre. Ponce is a town in the south of Puerto Rico. There was a massacre of people that were peacefully protesting. And of course, again, depending on who you ask, it wasn't peaceful, but yeah, it was. And the best way I can prove to you that it was peaceful is that none of the people protesting had guns. The police did. And the police was ordered around by the governor, who was an American. That's all I'm going to say on that. There's a lot more that you can look up, including how we're treated now, where because we are not a free country, we are tied financially and everything else by the United States. We cannot make our independent relationships with other countries. We have this thing, laws of, I'm going to say cabotage because I can't find another word for cabotaje. But basically, in a nutshell, anything that's shipped to Puerto Rico has to go through a specific source that is mandated by the United States government, which makes it very hard for us to work with prices on things without having to pay it. And so when you go to the store and you pay something, you don't think you're paying, before we even had taxes, because now we do have taxes. But back in the day when I was growing up, we didn't pay taxes, but the reality is that part of the price that we were charged for an item was including the tax that was paid to bring the stuff to Puerto Rico. The taxes and, of course, shipping. So there is a lot to be said about the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico, and about slavery in Puerto Rico by Europeans before that. And the discovery that I've made throughout the years, and specifically when I started doing this research, is that I always wondered why Puerto Ricans never rebelled. We never grabbed our pitchforks and put up a fight. And part of it, to me, has to do with those 355 years of slavery, and of course the abuse against the Taínos before that. And so when people talk to me about how they need reparations and all this other stuff, it always cracks me up, because I'm sitting there thinking, we had slaves a lot longer than you did. And we have had a very interesting relationship, to say the least, with the United States for a lot longer. We don't have the ability to vote on anything that affects our island. We have a person that comes here every, an elected official that comes and talks on our behalf, but that person cannot vote. We have old presidents and future presidents go to Puerto Rico and do their little spiel and whatnot, but we cannot vote for the president of the United States, even though we belong to the United States. So when you're talking about privilege and how, oh, most of you are white, which, by the way, we're not, you have to remember that there's more to it than the color of somebody's skin, and that the fact that you look at me and you think white doesn't mean that I am, or that I haven't lived with racism of any kind, or that I don't understand the plight of somebody that has been dealt with very sternly because of the color of the skin. And yes, African Americans tend to get in trouble with the law more often than white people, you think? So do Hispanics. The minute we open our mouth and say something, we can get in trouble. And so does every other minority. You see, the point that I'm trying to make is this. I can sit here and cry about how I want reparations, or I can actually teach these people how to treat me. You have to make that choice yourself. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.